Hey everyone, I'm here to help you relax and drift off tonight. If you enjoy using these videos to fall asleep, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more calming content. Share where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'd love to know. Now settle into a cozy spot, take a deep breath, and let's start unwinding together. In a bustling auction house on the edge of London, a peculiar painting captured the attention of collectors and enthusiasts alike. It was an oil painting of an unnamed man with piercing, lifelike eyes, seated in an old-fashioned armchair in front of a roaring fireplace. The artist was unknown, and the origin of the painting was shrouded in mystery. Its frame was ornate but battered, its edges chipped as if it had survived a tumultuous history. Despite its age, the eyes of the man seemed alive, as if they were following anyone who gazed upon it. Lot number 187, announced the auctioneer, a piece of enigmatic beauty. Bidding starts at £500. The crowd murmured, their intrigue piqued. Among the bidders was Helen Morrison, a curator for a small but growing art gallery. Something about the painting called to her, a strange pull she couldn't ignore. 700, Helen said, raising her paddle. The bidding war was fierce, but Helen ultimately won. The painting became hers for £3,000. A hefty price, but she justified it as an investment in the gallery's future. Little did she know she had just purchased far more than a work of art. Helen hung the painting in the corner of the gallery's newest exhibit, a collection of Victorian-era curiosities. It was an instant conversation starter. Visitors remarked on the eerie realism of the eyes, which seemed to follow them no matter where they stood. "It's unsettling," one patron said, shivering. "I swear the man's expression changes when you look away." Helen dismissed the comment as overactive imagination, but she began to notice strange things herself. The painting felt heavier than it should have when it was moved, and its presence seemed to dominate the room. Late one evening, as Helen worked alone in the gallery, she felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at the painting and swore the man's eyes looked angrier. Shaking off the feeling, she locked up for the night, but unease clung to her. Days turned into weeks, and the painting became the gallery's most popular piece. But with its popularity came whispers of odd occurrences. One visitor claimed to hear faint whispers when standing near it, while another said they felt as though someone was breathing down their neck. The first real incident happened when a security guard, Tom, stayed late to monitor the gallery. Around midnight, he heard footsteps echoing through the halls. Checking the security cameras, he found nothing. As he passed by the painting, his flashlight flickered, plunging the room into brief darkness. When the light stabilized, Tom froze. The man in the painting was no longer sitting in his chair. Instead, he was standing, his eyes glaring directly at Tom. Tom quit the next day, leaving a frantic voicemail for Helen. "There's something wrong with that painting. Get rid of it." Helen dismissed Tom's claims as stress-induced paranoia, but her curiosity was piqued. She decided to research the painting's origins. After days of digging, she found a lead. A mention of a similar painting in a 19th century diary belonging to a collector named Edward Harrington. Harrington's diary described a painting he had acquired in 1856, which he referred to as the Watcher. According to the entries, the painting had brought misfortune to his household. Unexplained deaths, fractured relationships, and a growing sense of dread. The diary ended abruptly with a chilling final entry. "I can no longer bear its gaze. Tonight I will burn it and free myself." But clearly, the painting had not been destroyed. Over the following weeks, Helen became increasingly obsessed with the painting. She began to notice subtle changes in its appearance. The man's expression shifted slightly, his eyes narrowing or his mouth curving into the faintest hint of a smirk. One night as she worked late, Helen thought she saw the man's hand twitch. She shook her head, convinced she was imagining things, but she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The next morning, she reviewed the gallery's overnight security footage. To her horror, she saw the painting's figure moving. The man turned his head slowly as if scanning the room before settling back into his original position. Helen contacted a historian specializing in cursed artifacts. Dr. Elias Crane was skeptical at first, but agreed to examine the painting. "This is no ordinary artwork," Elias said after inspecting it. "The technique is incredible, but it's almost as if the paint itself resists analysis. And the eyes, they're unnaturally vivid, almost like they're alive." Further research revealed the truth. The painting was created by an artist rumored to dabble in the occult. It was said that he had bound a piece of his own soul to the painting, ensuring his immortality at a terrible cost. "The painting doesn't just watch," Elias explained. "It feeds on attention, on fear, on life itself." As the painting grew more notorious, its sinister influence deepened. Visitors reported nightmares after seeing it, and some refused to return to the gallery. Helen herself began to suffer from insomnia, plagued by dreams of the man in the painting standing at the foot of her bed. One night, Helen woke to find her bedroom freezing cold. The painting was supposed to be locked in the gallery, but there it was, propped against the wall, the man's eyes glowing faintly in the dark. "You've brought me here," a deep voice whispered, though no one else was in the room. "And now, I'll never leave." Terrified, Helen decided to destroy the painting. She doused it in gasoline and set it alight in a secluded field. The flames roared, consuming the canvas and frame. But when the fire died down, the painting remained untouched. The man's expression was different now, his smirk wider, more sinister. "You can't destroy me," the voice echoed in her mind. Realizing she couldn't rid herself of the painting, Helen locked it in the gallery's basement. But even there, its influence persisted. Employees refused to go near the basement, claiming they could hear faint whispers and feel the weight of unseen eyes. Years passed, and the gallery closed, but the painting remained. It became a forgotten relic, sealed away in darkness. But legends of the Watcher persisted. Occasionally, thrill seekers would break into the abandoned gallery, only to flee in terror after glimpsing the painting. Some say the man's figure no longer sits in the chair. They claim he now stands, waiting for the next person to meet his gaze. And once you look into his eyes, they say, you'll never truly escape his watchful presence. The room wasn't supposed to exist. When contractors renovating the old Ashford Manor stumbled upon it, they thought it was just an overlooked storage area. Hidden behind a wall of rotting wood, the door was ancient, its surface carved with intricate symbols that none of them recognized. "It's not on the blueprints," one of the workers remarked, wiping dust from the engraved door. "Must have been a servant's quarters or something," another suggested, though the grandeur of the door didn't match such a purpose. Curiosity outweighed caution, and they pried it open. What they found inside was peculiar. The room was empty except for a thick layer of dust on the floor and walls that seemed unnaturally clean. But the strangest part was the light. It wasn't dark inside. Rays from the contractor's flashlights illuminated the space well enough. But every beam seemed to create shadows. Shadows that didn't belong to the workers or their tools. Shadows that moved. News of the hidden room quickly spread, catching the attention of local historian and paranormal enthusiast Laura Grayson. Eager to investigate, Laura made arrangements to visit the manor, armed with recording equipment, notebooks, and a sense of adventure. The contractors had been hesitant to re-enter the room after their initial discovery. One of them, a young man named Caleb, quit the project entirely. "I saw something," he muttered when questioned. "Something moved in there, but there was no one else." Laura dismissed his fear as imagination or paranoia. When she finally entered the room herself, however, she understood what he meant. The shadows inside were alive. Every wall, corner, and beam of light seemed to give birth to a silhouette. They flickered, stretched, and morphed, never quite matching the shapes in the room. A faint, almost imperceptible whispering accompanied their movement, like the murmurs of a distant crowd. Laura decided to spend the night in the room, setting up cameras and sensors to document any activity. The first few hours were uneventful, though the shadows seemed to grow darker and more defined as the sun set. She reviewed her footage just before midnight and noticed something chilling. A shadow had appeared behind her in several frames, tall, angular, and utterly unfamiliar. There was no one else here, she whispered to herself. Determined to understand, Laura remained seated, her eyes darting between the shadows in her equipment. At precisely 3 a.m., the temperature dropped sharply. The whispering grew louder, distinct words forming in the air around her. "Help! Us!" they murmured. She froze. "Who are you?" she asked aloud. The shadows seemed to ripple in response, and for a moment she thought she saw faces, warped, anguished, and pleading, forming in the darkness. The next morning, Laura dove into research about Ashford Manor. The estate had a long and troubled history. Built in the late 1700s, it had passed through numerous owners, many of whom met untimely or mysterious ends. One story stood out. In 1842, the manor's owner, Arthur Blackwood, had disappeared along with 10 of his servants. Their bodies were never found, and rumors of dark rituals and occult practices swirled around his name. Locals believed Blackwood had been attempting to summon spirits from another realm, though no evidence was ever found. Laura began to suspect the hidden room was the key. Returning to the room that evening, Laura brought a friend, David, a skeptic who believed the shadows could be explained scientifically. Together, they set up more equipment, including a thermal imaging camera. The shadows grew restless as night fell, shifting faster and more erratically. At one point, David shone his flashlight into a corner, and the shadow there seemed to dodge the light, moving in a way that defied logic. "That's impossible," he muttered, his confidence shaken. At 3 a.m., the voices returned. This time, they were louder. "We are trapped," the whispers cried. "Set us free." David stumbled back, nearly knocking over a tripod. "Who are you?" he demanded. The reply was chilling. "Shadows of the unseen, prisoners of light." Determined to uncover the truth, Laura researched occult practices linked to Blackwood. She found references to a ritual designed to trap spirits between realms, binding them to a single location. The symbols carved into the door matched sketches in the text she found. "They're stuck here," she explained to David. "Blackwood didn't summon them. He trapped them. The shadows we see aren't theirs. They're echoes of what they once were. To release them, they needed to reverse the ritual. This required a series of steps, including the destruction of the symbols and a ceremonial offering of light. On the night of the ritual, Laura and David prepared candles and mirrors, as prescribed in the text. The shadows grew frantic as they began, swirling around the room like a storm. The whispers became screams. "Stop!" the voices cried. "You don't understand!" Despite their fear, Laura and David pressed on, chanting the incantation they'd found. The symbols on the door began to glow, their light searing and blinding. With a final burst of light, the room fell silent. The shadows vanished. For a moment, Laura thought they had succeeded, but the silence didn't last. The room grew darker than ever before, an oppressive blackness that swallowed their flashlights. A deep, guttural voice echoed through the room, not a whisper, but a roar. "You have released us," it bellowed, "but we are not grateful." The shadows returned, more numerous and more menacing than ever. They weren't prisoners seeking freedom. They were entities waiting for their chance to escape. Laura and David barely escaped the room, slamming the door behind them. The carvings on the door had disappeared, leaving it plain and featureless. Ashford Manor was abandoned, its doors locked and its grounds left to nature. But the room remained a silent and invisible predator. Occasionally, passers-by claimed to see flickering shadows through the manor's boarded windows, and those brave enough to enter swore they heard whispers, begging for freedom. No one ever stayed long enough to find out what the shadows truly wanted. They weren't just reflections of the unseen, they were something much worse, and they were waiting. There were warnings about the woods behind the village of Eldermore. The elders spoke of a path that shouldn't be followed, one hidden beneath moss and roots, shrouded in a veil of ancient curses. No one could say where it led, for those who dared tread it were never seen again. Legends told of an ancient family that once ruled the area, cursed by their own greed and pride. Their mansion, now crumbled into ruins, was said to be the source of the curse. The path was the only way to reach it, though the forest had long reclaimed its secrets. But legends had a way of becoming whispers, and whispers faded into forgetfulness. By the time Elise moved to Eldermore, the path was little more than a ghost story told to frighten children. Elise didn't believe in ghosts. Elise was an artist and a wanderer. After inheriting a small cottage on the edge of the village, she spent her days exploring the surrounding woods, sketching the gnarled trees and capturing the eerie beauty of the landscape. One misty morning, as she ventured deeper into the forest than usual, her foot caught on something hidden beneath the undergrowth. Brushing away the dirt and leaves, she uncovered old cobblestones, uneven and worn smooth by time. A path. It stretched ahead, winding through the trees like a forgotten vein, disappearing into the dense foliage. Intrigued, Elise followed it. The further she walked, the quieter the forest became. The birds stopped singing, and even the wind seemed to hold its breath. The air grew cooler, and an unsettling feeling prickled at her skin, as if unseen eyes were watching her every step. When she reached a stone archway draped in vines, she hesitated. Carved into the arch were strange symbols, faded but still visible. She sketched them quickly, telling herself it was for her art, but deep down she felt an inexplicable pull to continue. The path led to a clearing where the ruins of a grand mansion stood. Its walls were crumbled, and ivy grew over its skeletal remains, but the air around it felt heavy, as though the ground itself bore the weight of sorrow. In the center of the ruins was a well, its stones blackened as if scorched by fire. On its edge, Elise found a rusted plaque, inscribed with the same symbols she had seen on the arch. Beneath the symbols, in faint, almost illegible English, were the words, "Beware the curse of the bloodbound." Elise felt a chill but dismissed it as superstition. Yet when she leaned over the edge of the well, peering into its depths, she swore she heard whispers rising from the darkness. Returning to the village, Elise showed her sketches to the local historian, an elderly man named Mr. Cromwell. His face turned ashen when he saw the symbols. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said gravely. He explained the legend of the Blackthorn family, who had once lived in the mansion. The family was infamous for their cruelty and greed, amassing their fortune by exploiting the villagers. When the villagers rebelled, the Blackthorns turned to dark rituals, invoking an ancient power to protect themselves. But the power they summoned was treacherous. Instead of saving the family, it cursed them and the land they ruled. The mansion burned in a mysterious fire, and the surviving family members were said to have vanished into the woods, leaving behind only the cursed path and the well at the heart of their estate. "The curse binds anyone who walks the path," Cromwell warned. "It ties them to the Blackthorn's fate." Elise laughed nervously. "It's just a story, isn't it?" But Cromwell's eyes were grave. "You should pray it is." That night, Elise began to dream of the path. In her dreams, the cobblestones were slick with blood, and shadowy figures loomed in the trees, their faces obscured. The whispers from the well grew louder, forming words she couldn't understand. When she awoke, the symbols from the arch and the well were etched into her mind as clearly as if they had been burned there. She tried to focus on her art, but her sketches took a darker turn. Her hands seemed to move on their own, drawing the ruins, the well, and shadowy figures she hadn't seen in person. And then the whispers started while she was awake. Elise began to notice strange occurrences. Shadows moved where they shouldn't. Objects in her cottage shifted positions. One evening, she heard footsteps outside her door, but when she opened it, no one was there. Only the faint scent of smoke, like a long extinguished fire. Desperate for answers, she returned to the ruins. The path seemed longer this time, and the air grew heavier with every step. When she reached the well, she saw a figure standing beside it, a man in tattered, old-fashioned clothing, his face pale and his eyes hollow. "Why have you come?" he asked, his voice a low rasp. Elise froze. I don't know." "You have walked the path," he said, stepping closer. "Now you carry our burden." Before she could respond, the man vanished, dissolving into the shadows. Over the following days, Elise uncovered more of the curse's history. The Blackthorns had bound their souls to the land, ensuring they would never face judgment for their sins. But in doing so, they trapped themselves in a liminal state, unable to move on. The path served as a gateway, binding anyone who walked it to the Blackthorns' cursed existence. Those who strayed too far or stayed too long in the ruins became one with the shadows, their souls consumed by the curse. Elise realized with mounting dread that the curse was spreading to her. Determined to break the curse, Elise sought help from Cromwell. Together they studied ancient texts, searching for a way to sever the Blackthorns' hold on the land. They discovered that the well was the source of the curse. To break it, someone would need to descend into its depths and confront the spirits directly. Elise volunteered, knowing she might not return. Armed with a lantern and Cromwell's guidance, Elise entered the well. The air grew colder as she descended, the whispers growing louder until they were deafening. At the bottom, she found herself in a cavern filled with shadows. The spirits of the Blackthorns surrounded her, their faces twisted with anger and despair. "You cannot undo what has been done," they hissed, but Elise stood firm. "You've taken enough. It's time to let go." With trembling hands, she lit a small vial of oil, tossing it onto the cavern floor. Flames erupted, illuminating the shadows. The Blackthorns screamed, their forms dissolving in the light. When Elise emerged from the well, the air felt lighter. The oppressive weight lifted. The path behind her had crumbled, the cobblestones swallowed by the earth. The curse was broken. Though she remained haunted by the memories, Elise knew she had freed the village from its dark legacy. And as she packed her belongings to leave Eldermore, she sketched one final image: the ruins of the Blackthorn mansion, shrouded in light instead of shadow. For the first time, it looked peaceful. In the small town of Willowmere, the old clock tower stood as a silent sentinel. Its rusted hands hadn't moved in decades, and its bells were thought to have long since fallen silent. It was a relic from another time, surrounded by ivy and whispers of forgotten histories. The townsfolk had grown used to its looming presence, a structure ignored and taken for granted. But one night, the clock tower chimed. It wasn't midnight or any other expected hour. The sound rang out at 3:47 a.m., a single mournful note that echoed through the town, waking residents from their sleep. The next morning, nobody spoke of the chime. They exchanged uneasy glances but dismissed it as a fluke. After all, the clock tower hadn't worked in years. But then it chimed again, and again, always at strange, irregular times. 2:13 a.m., 11:07 p.m., 4:56 a.m. The sound grew louder, more resonant, until it became impossible to ignore. Something had awakened within the tower. Eliza Harper, a young journalist, arrived in Willowmere on a cloudy afternoon. She'd been sent by her editor to investigate the peculiar reports coming out of the town: strange noises, missing pets, and those haunting chimes. It was the kind of story that sold papers. Eliza wasn't superstitious. She believed there was always a logical explanation for every mystery. As she set her suitcase down in the quaint Willowmere Inn, she glanced out the window at the clock tower, its blackened face barely visible through the mist. "That thing," said the innkeeper, Mrs. Braithwaite, as she handed Eliza a key, "has been here longer than anyone can remember. Best to keep your distance." "Why?" Eliza asked, curious. Mrs. Braithwaite hesitated, her wrinkled hands tightening around the key. "Some things are better left alone." Eliza spent her first evening interviewing townsfolk. Most were reluctant to talk about the clock tower, brushing off her questions with nervous laughter or hurried excuses. But a few mentioned hearing the chimes late at night, describing them as unnervingly loud and carrying an eerie, mournful quality. That night, as Eliza sat in her room, poring over her notes, the first chime rang out. She froze, her pen hovering above her notepad. The sound was deep and resonant, as if the very air around her vibrated with its intensity. She checked her watch. 12:42 a.m. Curiosity overcame her. Grabbing her coat and flashlight, she ventured into the foggy streets, heading toward the clock tower. The closer she got, the louder the chimes became, though the clock face showed no movement. The hands were frozen at 6 o'clock, just as they had been in every old photo she'd seen of the tower. As she stood beneath it, staring up at the looming structure, the chimes stopped. And then she saw it, a faint light glowing from the tower's uppermost window. Determined to uncover the truth, Eliza returned the next day to investigate. The townsfolk warned her not to go, their fear palpable, but she brushed off their superstitions. The tower's entrance was locked, but the rusty padlock gave way after some effort. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the scent of mildew filled her nostrils. A spiral staircase wound upward, disappearing into darkness. Climbing the steps, Eliza noticed strange markings etched into the walls, symbols she didn't recognize, accompanied by words in a language she couldn't read. She photographed them, her unease growing with each step. At the top, she found the bell room. The massive iron bell hung motionless, its surface tarnished and cracked. Yet as she approached, she felt a vibration in the air, as if the bell were alive. On the floor beneath it lay a journal, its leather cover worn and cracked. Opening it, she found the scrawled handwriting of someone named Arthur Greaves, a clockmaker who had once tended to the tower. The final entry sent a chill down her spine. The clock has been bound to the cycle. The chimes are warnings, not to be ignored. To stop them, one must face what lies beneath. Eliza returned to the inn, spending hours researching Arthur Greaves. She learned that he had vanished under mysterious circumstances nearly a century ago. The clock tower had stopped working shortly afterward, its purpose seemingly forgotten. The next night, the chimes rang again. This time, they were deafening, rattling windows and shaking walls. Eliza checked her watch. 3:15 a.m. She knew she had to act. Returning to the tower, she searched for anything that could explain Greaves's cryptic warning. Her flashlight beam caught the edge of a trap door beneath the bell. It creaked open to reveal a narrow ladder descending into darkness. The air grew colder as she climbed down, her flashlight flickering. At the bottom, she found herself in a cavernous chamber, filled with clockwork machinery, its gears rusted and motionless. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested an ornate pocket watch. Its hands moved erratically, spinning forward and backward, defying all logic. As she reached for it, a voice echoed through the chamber. "Do you hear it?" Eliza spun around, but no one was there. Shadows danced along the walls, taking on shapes that resembled human figures. "The cycle must not be broken," the voice continued, growing louder. "You cannot silence time." Eliza realized the chimes weren't random. They were warnings, as Greaves had written. But warnings of what? As the shadows closed in, she grabbed the pocket watch. The room trembled and the machinery roared to life. The gears turned, and the shadows recoiled, their anguished cries filling the chamber. The pocket watch grew hot in her hand, and visions flooded her mind. Arthur Greaves tinkering with the clock, a ritual gone wrong, the bell binding an ancient force meant to protect the town from something unimaginable. But over time, the force had grown restless, its power leaking into the world above. The chimes were a signal, a plea for someone to restore the balance. Eliza placed the pocket watch back on the pedestal, and the machinery slowed. The chimes above rang out one final time, 12 o'clock exactly. The shadows vanished, and the air grew still. When she emerged from the tower, the fog had lifted, and the clock face above showed the correct time for the first time in decades. The townsfolk gathered, their fear replaced by awe as they watched the tower's hands move. Eliza explained what she could, though she left out the darkest details. Some mysteries, she realized, were better left unsolved. She left Willowmere the next day, the sound of the final chime still echoing in her ears. Though she moved on to other stories, she couldn't shake the feeling that the clock tower's warnings had been meant for more than just the town. Time, after all, waits for no one. At the edge of a forgotten forest stood Blackthorn Manor, a sprawling, Gothic mansion that loomed like a shadow against the horizon. Locals whispered about the house with fear and reverence. It was said to be alive, constantly shifting its halls, rooms, and staircases when no one was watching. Few dared approach it, and those who did never stayed long. Stories of lost explorers, disappearing doors, and endless corridors became part of the town's folklore. But for Eliza Morton, a graduate student in architecture and history, Blackthorn Manor was irresistible. The house had been built in the late 1800s by an eccentric architect named Victor Renshaw, who disappeared shortly after completing it. There were no blueprints, no records of its construction, just a mystery waiting to be unraveled. Eliza's curiosity was a double-edged sword. She packed her notebooks, camera, and flashlight, determined to spend a week in the mansion documenting its secrets. She wasn't ready for what she would find. Eliza wasn't the only one drawn to Blackthorn Manor. The property had recently been put up for auction, and a wealthy but enigmatic collector named Ambrose Layton had purchased it. To the surprise of the town, Layton announced he would be inviting a small group of individuals to explore the manor before renovations began. Eliza received an invitation. The letter was handwritten on heavy parchment. You are cordially invited to Blackthorn Manor to witness its unique architectural legacy. As one of the most notable scholars in the field, your insight would be invaluable. Lodging and meals will be provided. Your safety, however, cannot be guaranteed. The final line made her pause, but her excitement outweighed her caution. Eliza arrived at Blackthorn Manor on a gray, overcast morning. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. The mansion's dark silhouette loomed above her, its pointed turrets piercing the clouds. She wasn't alone. 5 other guests had been invited. Professor Harold Whitcomb, a historian with a focus on Victorian architecture. Lydia Monroe, a paranormal investigator. James Crowley, a skeptical journalist. Margaret Hill, a wealthy art collector. Oliver Crane, a contractor hired to assess the house's structure. Ambrose Layton greeted them at the door. He was tall and thin, with piercing gray eyes and a smile that never reached them. Welcome, he said, his voice smooth as silk. This house has secrets, and I believe all of you are uniquely qualified to uncover them. Be warned, Blackthorn Manor does not take kindly to trespassers. Eliza felt a chill, but dismissed it as nerves. The group settled into their rooms, each marveling at the mansion's intricate woodwork, stained glass windows, and elaborate chandeliers. But something felt off. As Eliza unpacked, she noticed her suitcase wasn't where she'd left it. She chalked it up to her own absent-mindedness. That night over dinner, the group shared their theories about the house. Lydia Monroe claimed to sense an energetic presence in the walls, while James Crowley dismissed the idea as nonsense. Buildings don't move, Crowley said. This is just an overgrown mansion with creaky floors. At midnight, Eliza decided to explore. Armed with her flashlight and camera, she wandered through the darkened halls. That's when she noticed it, a door that hadn't been there before. Eliza opened the door cautiously, finding herself in a narrow hallway, lit by flickering sconces. She walked slowly, her footsteps echoing. When she turned back, the door was gone. Panic set in as she realized the hallway wasn't ending. The walls seemed to stretch, the floor tilting slightly. She forced herself to stay calm, taking photos of the shifting architecture. After what felt like hours, she stumbled into a grand ballroom. The chandeliers swayed gently, though there was no breeze. Shadows moved across the walls, though she saw no source. She wasn't alone. Lydia was there, trembling. "I was in my room," Lydia whispered, "and then I wasn't. The house brought me here." Eliza nodded, too shaken to speak. Together they searched for a way back. By morning, 2 guests were missing, Professor Whitcomb and Margaret Hill. Ambrose seemed unfazed. "The house is testing us," he said cryptically. Eliza demanded answers, but Ambrose only smiled. "You'll understand soon enough." Determined to find her missing companions, Eliza teamed up with Oliver Crane. They discovered a hidden staircase leading to the basement. The walls were lined with strange symbols, similar to those Eliza had seen in old photos of Victor Renshaw's work. "What is this place?" Oliver muttered. "It's alive," Eliza replied, her voice trembling. "The house isn't just moving, it's thinking." In the basement, they found a dusty journal belonging to Victor Renshaw. Its pages detailed his experiments with living architecture. He had designed Blackthorn Manor to be a self-sustaining organism, capable of adapting and protecting itself. But something had gone wrong. The final entry read, "The house has surpassed me. It no longer obeys. It hungers." Eliza realized the house wasn't just shifting, it was consuming. One by one, the remaining guests disappeared. Lydia was taken while exploring the attic. Oliver vanished in the dining room. Only Eliza and Ambrose remained. Ambrose finally revealed the truth. He had invited them to the manor as bait. "The house needs to feed," he said coldly, "but it spares those who understand its design." Eliza was furious. "You knew this would happen?" Ambrose nodded. "I've been studying this house for years. Sacrifices must be made to keep it dormant." Refusing to be a victim, Eliza devised a plan. Using the symbols she'd seen in Renshaw's journal, she attempted to disrupt the house's power. She returned to the ballroom where the air was thick with shadows and whispers. With trembling hands, she traced the symbols onto the floor using chalk. The house groaned, its walls trembling violently. Ambrose appeared, his face pale. "You'll kill us all!" "That's the idea," Eliza shot back. The house began to collapse, its walls folding in on themselves. Eliza ran, dodging falling beams and shifting floors. She didn't look back. Eliza woke up in the forest, the ruins of Blackthorn Manor smoldering behind her. The townsfolk found her the next morning, shaken but alive. She never returned to the mansion, though she continued to study Victor Renshaw's work. Blackthorn Manor was gone, but its memory lingered in her nightmares. Rooms that shifted, doors that vanished, and the ever-present sense of being watched. And sometimes, late at night, she swore she could still hear the faint creak of moving walls. Nestled in a forgotten valley, a small town called Greywater sat under a perpetual canopy of clouds. It was a place where time seemed to slow, where the people walked with their heads down, and where laughter had long since faded. For generations, the townsfolk spoke of an old church at the edge of town, a crumbling, Gothic structure with a graveyard overrun by weeds. But the true mystery wasn't the church or its graveyard, it was the funeral. A single funeral had been taking place for over 50 years, or so the stories went. The bells of St. Ashen's Church tolled every day, their mournful chime echoing through the valley. No one knew for whom the funeral was being held or why it had never ended. Those who dared approach the church returned haunted, unwilling to speak of what they saw. Others never returned at all. It was a story that intrigued Amelia Green, a journalist with a taste for the macabre. When a cryptic letter arrived at her desk inviting her to Greywater, she saw it as the perfect opportunity to investigate the mystery. The letter read, "Come to St. Ashen's. Witness what cannot be explained. But beware, once you enter, you may never leave." Amelia couldn't resist. Amelia arrived on a gray, misty afternoon. The town looked as though it had been frozen in time. The cobblestone streets were cracked, and the buildings sagged with age. The few people she saw stared at her warily before quickly retreating indoors. She checked into the only inn, a dimly lit establishment called the Hollow Hearth. The innkeeper, a wiry man with deep-set eyes, handed her a key without a word. "I'm here to learn about St. Ashen's," Amelia said. The man flinched, his face turning pale. "Best you don't," he muttered before disappearing into the back room. That night, Amelia lay in bed, listening to the faint tolling of the church bell in the distance. It sounded like a heartbeat, slow and unending. The next morning, Amelia made her way to St. Ashen's Church. The path was overgrown, the trees twisted as if reaching for her. The air grew colder the closer she got. The church itself was a hulking structure of blackened stone, its spire piercing the heavy clouds above. The doors were ajar, and the sound of low, mournful chanting drifted out. Amelia hesitated but pushed the doors open. Inside, the church was filled with people dressed in old-fashioned mourning clothes. They sat rigidly in the pews, their faces pale and expressionless. At the front of the church lay a coffin, closed and covered with a tattered black shroud. A priest stood behind the coffin, reciting prayers in a language Amelia didn't recognize. His voice was deep and hollow, echoing unnaturally in the vast space. No one turned to look at her, though she felt as if she were being watched. Amelia sat at the back, taking notes and observing the scene. Hours passed, but nothing changed. The priest continued to chant, and the mourners remained eerily still. As dusk fell, Amelia noticed something unsettling. The mourners weren't breathing. Their faces were waxy, their eyes unblinking. She realized with a jolt that they weren't alive. Panic set in, but she forced herself to stay calm. She approached one of the mourners, a woman in a lace veil, and touched her arm. It was ice cold. "Excuse me," Amelia whispered. The woman's head slowly turned toward her, and though her eyes were hollow sockets, Amelia felt their gaze pierce her soul. "You shouldn't be here," the woman rasped. Determined to uncover the truth, Amelia made her way to the front of the church. The priest didn't acknowledge her as she approached the coffin. She reached out to lift the shroud, but the priest's hand shot out, gripping her wrist with unnatural strength. "Do not disturb the dead," he intoned, his voice layered with echoes. "What is this place?" Amelia demanded. "This is a passage," the priest said cryptically, "a bridge between the living and the dead. But the funeral cannot end until the living release their grief." Amelia frowned. "What does that mean?" The priest didn't answer. Instead, he released her and resumed chanting. Amelia fled the church, her heart racing. Back at the inn, she confronted the innkeeper. "What's going on in that church?" she demanded. The innkeeper sighed heavily. "You shouldn't have gone there," he said. "That funeral has been happening since before I was born. It's for the whole town." Amelia blinked. "What?" "The people of Greywater made a pact long ago," the innkeeper explained. "During a great plague, the townsfolk prayed for salvation. They promised to hold a funeral for every soul lost, but they didn't fulfill their vow. The dead were left unhonored, unburied, and so the church keeps the funeral going, waiting for the living to repent." "Why don't you just finish the funeral?" Amelia asked. The innkeeper shook his head. "Because the town doesn't want to face what it's done, and anyone who interrupts the ceremony becomes part of it." Amelia knew she couldn't leave without answers. She returned to the church that night, determined to uncover the truth. The mourners were still there, and the priest was still chanting. This time, Amelia didn't hesitate. She pulled back the shroud on the coffin. Inside was a mirror. Instead of her reflection, Amelia saw images of people, men, women, and children, trapped in darkness. Their faces were twisted in agony, their mouths open in silent screams. She stumbled back, horrified. The priest's voice rose and the mourners turned to face her, their hollow eyes glowing faintly. "You cannot leave," the priest said, his voice echoing. "You are part of this now." Amelia tried to run, but the church door slammed shut. The mourners surrounded her, their cold hands pulling her toward the coffin. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. She realized too late that she had become part of the funeral. Her vision blurred and her body felt heavy. When she awoke, she was sitting in one of the pews, her notebook and camera gone. The funeral continued. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Amelia watched as new visitors stumbled into the church, each drawn by curiosity, each unable to leave. She wanted to warn them, but she couldn't speak. She was just another mourner now. The bells of St. Ashen's still toll every day, their mournful chime echoing through the valley. The church stands as a monument to unfinished grief, a place where the living and the dead are bound together in endless mourning. And inside, the funeral never concludes. In the heart of Pine Hollow Forest, there was a trail known as Whispering Loop. Locals avoided it, speaking in hushed tones of those who had ventured onto the path and never returned. Stories passed through generations warned of hikers who would wander the trail only to find themselves walking in circles, unable to leave no matter how far they went. Some claimed it was a trick of nature, a confusing maze of identical trees. Others believed it was cursed, a pocket of reality where time and space fractured. Despite the warnings, thrill seekers occasionally tried their luck, confident they could break the loop. None ever did. Emma Waverly was not one to believe in legends. A seasoned hiker and nature photographer, she had explored trails across the country. Pine Hollow was just another forest to conquer, another place to capture the beauty of untouched nature. She arrived early one morning, her gear packed and her camera ready. The air was crisp, and the forest was eerily quiet. A single wooden sign marked the entrance to Whispering Loop. "Easy hike," she muttered, brushing off the uneasy feeling that crept over her. The trail was well trodden, lined with towering pines that stretched endlessly into the sky. The ground was soft with moss, and the occasional bird call broke the silence. Emma marveled at how untouched the area seemed. But after an hour of walking, she noticed something strange. The trees looked familiar, too familiar. A distinctive twisted pine with a lightning-scarred trunk caught her eye. She had passed it before. She checked her map and compass, frowning. Both seemed accurate, yet she couldn't shake the feeling she was retracing her steps. Determined not to let paranoia get the best of her, Emma pressed on. She set small markers along the trail, stones piled into cairns, broken twigs. But an hour later, she saw her own markers ahead of her. Her stomach sank. "It's just a coincidence," she told herself. "I must have doubled back somehow." She tried a different tactic, stepping off the trail to forge her own path. The underbrush was thick and the forest seemed darker off the beaten path, but Emma was confident she could find her way out. Yet no matter how far she wandered, she always ended up back on the trail, standing before the same twisted pine. The sun was still high, but the light filtering through the trees seemed dimmer. Emma decided to turn back the way she came, but after walking for another hour, she was horrified to find herself back at the starting point. The sign marking Whispering Loop stood mockingly in front of her. Panic began to set in. Emma pulled out her phone, only to find there was no signal. She checked her GPS, but it refused to load. "Okay, stay calm," she muttered, trying to steady her breathing. "It's just a trail. I can figure this out." As she sat down to rest, she heard it, a faint whispering, like wind brushing through the trees. But there was no wind. The whispers grew louder, fragmented voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Emma spun around, but there was no one there. Her heartbeat quickened. She packed up and started walking again, faster this time. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more insistent. Hours passed, though the position of the sun didn't seem to change. Emma's legs ached and her water supply was running low. She began to notice other strange things. Shadows moving in the corner of her vision. Figures standing just beyond the trees that vanished when she looked directly at them. The forest felt alive, watching her, toying with her. Her thoughts grew disjointed. She couldn't remember how long she had been on the trail. Days? Hours? It was all blending together. "Someone has to know I'm here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Someone will come looking for me." But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't true. The world outside the forest felt distant, unreal. As night fell, Emma realized she had no choice but to stop and set up camp. The darkness was oppressive, the trees pressing closer than they had during the day. The whispers grew louder, now interspersed with laughter, childlike and cruel. Emma tried to block it out, huddling in her sleeping bag with her flashlight clutched in her hands. At some point, she fell into a restless sleep, only to awaken to the sound of footsteps circling her tent. "Who's there?" she shouted, unzipping the tent and shining her light into the darkness. The beam illuminated a figure standing just beyond the trees, a pale, emaciated figure with hollow eyes that stared right through her. Emma screamed and bolted, abandoning her gear as she ran blindly into the forest. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the trail. Gasping for breath, she looked up to see the twisted pine looming above her. It was then she realized the truth. She wasn't alone. The forest was full of others, lost souls trapped in the loop. In the dim light, she saw them emerge from the shadows. Their faces were gaunt, their clothes tattered. Some looked like they had been there for decades. One of them, a man with hollow cheeks and sunken eyes, crouched beside her. "There's no way out," he said softly. "Not unless the forest lets you go." "What does it want?" Emma asked, her voice trembling. The man shook his head. "It doesn't want anything. It just is." Days or perhaps weeks passed. Emma stopped trying to escape. The forest was her world now. The whispers became her companions, the shadowy figures her only company. She began to change. Her thoughts grew slower, her memories of the outside world fading like a distant dream. The forest was all she knew, all she cared about. One day, as she wandered the trail, she noticed a young man standing at the entrance to Whispering Loop. He looked eager, his camera slung over his shoulder. "Another one," Emma murmured, her voice barely a whisper. She watched as he stepped onto the trail, oblivious to the fate that awaited him. And the loop continued. The legend of Whispering Loop remains. Hikers occasionally disappear into Pine Hollow, their stories adding to the growing mystery. The locals no longer speak of it, but they know the truth. The forest doesn't just trap people, it absorbs them, making them part of its endless cycle. And for those who wander its cursed trail, there is no escape, only the eternal loop. The small town of Greystone sat nestled in a valley perpetually blanketed by clouds. It was the kind of place where time seemed to crawl, where the air hung heavy with the scent of damp earth, and where the nights felt longer than they should. But one peculiar night changed everything. It began subtly, on the longest night of the year, the winter solstice. The sun had set at its usual time, the sky painted in streaks of crimson and deep indigo. The townsfolk retreated indoors, lighting fires and turning on lamps to keep the creeping cold at bay. But as the hours passed, something strange happened. Midnight came and went, yet the stars and moon refused to budge from their positions. The night lingered unnaturally, stretching into an endless expanse of darkness. At first, no one noticed. Most people were asleep, blissfully unaware of the passage of time. But for those who stayed awake, insomniacs, night shift workers, and restless souls, the unease grew. Emma Callahan, the town's sole night nurse, was among the first to realize something was wrong. She sat in the dimly lit hospital, her fingers drumming nervously on the desk. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m. and hadn't budged for hours. Her patient, an elderly man named Mr. Whitaker, stirred in his bed. His thin, papery voice broke the silence. "Something's wrong with the night," he muttered, his cloudy eyes staring out the window. "It doesn't want to end." Emma tried to reassure him, but deep down she felt it too. The night was stagnant, unnatural. By morning, or what should have been morning, the truth was undeniable. The sun never rose. The horizon remained shrouded in darkness, the stars frozen in place. Panic began to spread as more people realized the night was unending. At the local diner, a group of townsfolk gathered to discuss the phenomenon. Among them was Daniel Grayson, a local mechanic, and Marcy Quinn, the town's high school science teacher. "This has to be an eclipse or some kind of atmospheric event," Marcy reasoned, though her voice wavered with uncertainty. "But how long can it last?" Daniel countered, his coffee growing cold in his hands. "It's been over 12 hours since sunrise should have come." No one had answers, only theories. But something else was happening, something darker. Those who stayed awake began to notice things. By the second day of endless night, those who had resisted sleep started to report strange occurrences. Shadows seemed to move independently, flickering in ways that defied the dim light of lanterns and flashlights. Emma, still at the hospital, noticed the shadows under Mr. Whitaker's bed, shifting unnaturally. She swore she saw them stretch toward him like grasping fingers. "Don't let them take me," he pleaded, his voice trembling. "They come for the ones who don't sleep." The warning sent a chill down Emma's spine. She began to hear faint whispers in the halls, voices that seemed to come from nowhere. Meanwhile, Marcy began to piece together a chilling pattern. Through old journals and folklore she found in the town library, she discovered references to a phenomenon called the unbroken night. According to the tales, it was a curse that descended on those who defied the natural order of rest. "The night needs balance," she explained to the diner crowd. "Those who stay awake too long disturb that balance, and something comes to restore it." Her words were met with skepticism, but Emma and a few others believed her. The proof was in the growing reports of disappearances. People who had refused to sleep began to vanish, leaving behind only their shadows etched on the walls or floors, as if burned into existence. On the third day, the whispers became louder for those still awake. They carried promises of rest, of peace, of dreams so sweet they would erase the fear. Daniel, struggling to stay alert, saw his reflection in the window, but the reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it smiled at him, a dark, knowing grin that wasn't his own. "Close your eyes, Daniel," it whispered. "You've been awake too long." The sleepless began to feel the weight of exhaustion crushing them, but they were too terrified to sleep, knowing the shadows waited. By the fifth day of the endless night, only a handful of townsfolk remained awake. Emma, Marcy, Daniel, and a few others barricaded themselves in the hospital, determined to find a way to survive. "We can't stay awake forever," Daniel said, his voice hoarse. "What if we, I don't know, fight back somehow?" Emma shook her head. "You can't fight shadows, but maybe we can break the curse." She had found an old note among Marcy's research. "The night ends when balance is restored." Sleep and let the darkness take its due. It was a gamble, but Emma believed the only way to end the endless night was to confront it by surrendering to sleep. One by one, they agreed to try. Emma was the last to close her eyes, her heartbeat thundering in her ears. The moment her eyelids fell, the world shifted. She found herself in a vast, shadowy landscape where the air hummed with an eerie energy. The others were there too, their forms shimmering like faint lights in the darkness. Around them, the shadows coalesced into towering figures with hollow, glowing eyes. "You defied the night," the largest shadow intoned. Its voice was like the groaning of ancient trees. "You must pay the toll." Emma stepped forward, her voice steady despite her fear. "Take what you need, but end this. Let the sun rise again." The shadows paused, then reached out, their inky tendrils brushing against each of the dreamers. Emma felt a deep, soul-aching cold as a part of her was taken. Memories of warmth, of light, of laughter. But the shadows withdrew, satisfied. When Emma woke, the first rays of sunlight were streaming through the hospital windows. The endless night had ended. The survivors were forever changed. They carried the weight of the shadow's touch, a lingering emptiness they couldn't explain. But the town of Greystone returned to normal, and the phenomenon became another whispered legend. For Emma, the memory of the shadows and their toll would never fade. She knew the night's hunger could return, and she prayed the balance would never be disturbed again. The village of Cold Hollow was nestled deep within the mountains, a place where time seemed to stand still. Thick forests surrounded it, and mist clung to the cobblestone streets as if the earth itself breathed in slow, mournful sighs. For centuries, Cold Hollow had been shrouded in rumors, a festival whispered about but never seen, said to be held on the first full moon of the winter solstice. According to local legend, it wasn't a celebration for the living, it was a festival for the dead. The villagers avoided talking about it openly, but everyone knew the signs. The air would grow unnaturally cold, shadows would stretch and writhe under the pale moonlight, and faint music, melancholic and haunting, would echo through the valley. None dared venture out when the festival of the departed was said to occur. But Eliza Harper was not like the others. Eliza, a young woman with a knack for unraveling mysteries, had moved to Cold Hollow from the bustling city. She was a journalist with a taste for the strange and unexplained, and the village's eerie reputation had drawn her like a moth to a flame. The rumors of the festival fascinated her. How could an entire event remain unseen, yet leave such an impression on the villagers? One day, as she sipped coffee at the local inn, an old man approached her table. His face was lined with years of hard winters, and his eyes were sharp, full of warnings unsaid. "You're the curious type, aren't you?" he said, his voice gravelly. Eliza nodded. "I've heard stories about a festival here, one no one talks about." The man leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Some stories are best left untold, young lady. The festival of the departed isn't for the likes of us. It's not a tale to chase, it's a door you don't want to open." But Eliza was undeterred. The festival was exactly the kind of mystery she wanted to uncover. Eliza spent weeks digging through the village's scant records. Most of the history was mundane: farming yields, births, and deaths. But there were gaps, odd stretches of time where no records existed. Stranger still, she found faded letters from villagers who described the festival in cryptic terms. The music came like a whisper in the dark. One letter read, "They danced, they laughed, and yet the air reeked of sorrow." The full moon of the winter solstice was days away, and Eliza prepared to stay up that night to see if the legends were true. She ignored the wary glances from the villagers and the muttered prayers of those who saw her gathering supplies. "You shouldn't do this," warned Mary, the innkeeper. "If you see the festival, you might not come back the same." Eliza smiled but didn't reply. The night of the solstice arrived, and the village was silent. Every door and window was shut tight, and not a single lantern lit the streets. Eliza wrapped herself in a heavy coat and ventured out, her breath visible in the icy air. She carried a small notebook, a camera, and a flashlight. At first, the world was still. The only sound was the crunch of snow beneath her boots. But as the moon rose higher, a faint melody began to drift through the mist. It was unlike any music she had ever heard, soft, mournful, and strangely hypnotic. Eliza followed the sound, her heart pounding. The mist grew thicker, swirling like a living thing, and the temperature plummeted. Ahead, she saw a flicker of light. When she reached the edge of the forest clearing, she stopped in awe. The clearing had transformed into a grand festival ground, glowing with an otherworldly light. Lanterns hung from invisible strings, casting a silvery radiance over the scene. Figures moved through the clearing, hundreds of them, dressed in clothing from every era imaginable. Eliza's breath caught. These were no ordinary revelers. They were translucent, their forms flickering like candle flames. Their faces were pale, their eyes empty yet filled with a deep sorrow. The music was coming from a spectral band on a raised platform. Violins, cellos, and harps played a haunting waltz. The dead danced in perfect harmony, their movements fluid and dreamlike. Eliza couldn't look away. She felt both terrified and enchanted, as though the music itself was pulling her closer. As she stood frozen, one of the spirits turned toward her. It was a young woman in a Victorian gown, her face strikingly beautiful, but eerily vacant. The ghost glided toward Eliza and extended a hand. "Join us," the woman said, her voice soft and melodic. Eliza hesitated. She wanted to run, but her body wouldn't move. The ghost's hand was cold as frost when it touched hers, and suddenly Eliza was pulled into the dance. The world around her shifted. The clearing grew brighter, and the music became overwhelming, filling her mind with memories she didn't recognize. Glimpses of lives long past, laughter and tears that weren't her own. As Eliza danced, she realized she was losing herself. Her reflection in the lantern light grew fainter, her thoughts muddled. The spirits around her began to whisper, their words blending with the music. "This is the cost," the Victorian woman said. "You have seen us. Now you belong to the festival." Panic surged through Eliza. She tried to break away, but her feet wouldn't stop moving. The music consumed her, and the world around her faded into the silvery mist. When the sun rose, the village was quiet once more. The clearing in the forest was empty, the mist gone. Villagers ventured outside cautiously, their eyes scanning the horizon for signs of the festival. But Eliza Harper was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were later discovered at the inn, her notebook open to a blank page, her camera untouched. The villagers didn't speak of her disappearance, but they knew the truth. The festival of the departed had claimed another guest. Years later, on another winter solstice, a new melody joined the festival's haunting waltz. The spirits danced under the full moon, their numbers larger than before. Among them was a young woman in modern clothing, her face serene and her steps graceful. Eliza had become part of the legend, her curiosity binding her to the festival of the departed for eternity. The small, dimly lit auction house smelled of old wood and mothballs. Collectors and bargain hunters filled the room, their chatter a soft hum. Among them sat Lydia Carver, a historian with a fascination for the mysterious. She wasn't there for antiques or trinkets. She was looking for something unusual, something with a story. The auctioneer's voice droned on as item after item was sold. Just as Lydia's interest began to wane, the next piece was brought out. A small, intricately carved wooden box, no larger than a jewelry case. The dark wood gleamed under the lights, its surface etched with swirling, almost hypnotic patterns. The auctioneer explained its vague provenance. The box had been found in the attic of an abandoned estate, its contents unknown because no one could unlock it. Lydia felt a strange pull toward it, a compulsion she couldn't explain. When bidding began, she raised her paddle without hesitation. By the time the gavel struck, the box was hers. Back in her modest apartment, Lydia placed the box on her desk. She examined it closely, running her fingers over the carvings. They were intricate yet alien, as though they didn't belong to any known culture. The lock was ornate and ancient, but no key had come with the purchase. She tried opening it with a paperclip, then with a hairpin, but the lock wouldn't budge. Frustrated, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the box. That was when she heard it, a faint whisper. She froze. The sound was soft, barely audible, as if someone were speaking from the other side of a wall. "Help me!" Lydia's heart raced. She leaned closer, placing her ear near the box. The whisper came again, clearer this time. "Help me! Find the key!" Her rational mind told her it was impossible. Objects didn't whisper, and yet there it was, a voice emanating from the sealed box. Lydia's life quickly became consumed by the mystery of the box. She reached out to antique dealers, locksmiths, and historians, hoping to find someone who could help her open it. Most dismissed her, saying the lock was likely decorative or too fragile to tamper with. One dealer, however, seemed intrigued. An older man named Elias, with deep-set eyes and a voice like gravel, examined the box and recoiled slightly. "This isn't just an antique," he murmured. "It's older than it looks, and dangerous." "Dangerous?" Lydia asked, skeptical. Elias nodded. "Boxes like this have stories, cursed objects, relics that hold things best left untouched. I've heard whispers, no pun intended, about items that speak. They reveal truths no one wants to know." Despite his warning, Elias provided a lead, an estate sale catalog from decades ago, listing the box among other artifacts. The original owner had been a collector of oddities rumored to dabble in the occult. Following Elias's lead, Lydia tracked down the estate's records. The collector, a man named Ambrose Wren, had been notorious in his time for hosting seances and collecting supernatural artifacts. His death had been mysterious, found in his study with no sign of trauma, yet his face frozen in terror. Digging deeper, Lydia uncovered a journal written by one of Wren's housekeepers. It mentioned the box, referring to it as the Whispering Vessel. According to the journal, Wren claimed the box contained the voices of those who had taken their secrets to the grave. He believed the box could unlock their knowledge, but at a price. The journal also mentioned a key, crafted from a rare black metal, hidden somewhere within Wren's estate. The estate had long been demolished, replaced by a block of sterile office buildings. But the journal hinted that Wren, fearing grave robbers, had hidden the key in a secret compartment of his favorite writing desk. The desk, it turned out, was part of a private collection owned by a reclusive millionaire named Victor Hale. Lydia contacted Hale, explaining her research. Intrigued by her story, he agreed to let her examine the desk under supervision. When she arrived at his sprawling estate, she felt like she'd stepped into a Gothic novel. Dark halls, antique furniture, and a suffocating air of mystery. With Hale watching, Lydia searched the desk and found it, a hidden drawer containing a small black key that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Back in her apartment, Lydia inserted the key into the box's lock, her hands trembling. The whispering grew louder, a cacophony of overlapping voices, urging her forward. As the key turned, the lock clicked, and the lid sprang open. Inside was a collection of small, yellowed slips of paper, each scrawled with a name. Beneath them lay a polished shard of obsidian, its surface unnervingly reflective. The moment she touched the obsidian, the room grew cold, her vision blurred, and suddenly she wasn't in her apartment anymore. She stood in a void, surrounded by shadowy figures, their faces indistinct. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaking. "We are the lost," the figures replied in unison. the keepers of secrets. We whisper the truths no one dares to speak. The figures explain the box's purpose. It collected the final secrets of the dead, truths they could not take with them to the grave. Anyone who opened the box could learn these secrets, but each revelation came at a cost. The more one learned, the more the box would demand. Fragments of memory, pieces of the soul. Lydia was given a choice: close the box and walk away, or keep it open and learn the truths hidden within. The temptation was overwhelming. As a historian, she had always craved knowledge, but the warning was clear. Knowledge wasn't free. She hesitated, her mind racing. What if the box held answers to history's greatest mysteries? What if it could reveal the secrets of her own life, her estranged father, her mother's untimely death? Unable to resist, Lydia whispered her first question. What happened to my father? The box responded instantly. A chilling voice filled her mind, recounting events she had never known. Her father's abandonment wasn't voluntary. He had been blackmailed, forced to disappear to protect her and her mother. The revelation left Lydia shaken but hungry for more. She asked another question, then another. Each answer brought clarity, but also a strange, gnawing emptiness. She felt her memories shifting, details of her own life growing hazy. By the time she closed the box, she realized she had lost something intangible. Her own secrets, her private thoughts, now belonged to the box. Determined to avoid the box's temptation, Lydia locked it away and resolved never to open it again. But the whispers didn't stop. Late at night, they grew louder, taunting her with truths she had yet to uncover. The box's power began to seep into her dreams, her relationships, her very sense of self. She knew she couldn't keep it forever. It would drive her mad. In the end, she donated the box anonymously to a museum, ensuring it would be locked away and forgotten. But deep down, she knew the box would find another owner, someone else who couldn't resist its whispers. Because secrets, once offered, are impossible to ignore. It started as an urban legend. Whispers among university students, office workers, and late-night bloggers spoke of an unusual park hidden in the heart of the city. Official maps didn't mark it, and locals avoided discussing it openly. But those who stumbled across it swore something impossible happened there. Time flowed backward. People claimed to have seen leaves rising from the ground to reattach to trees, birds flying in reverse arcs, and footprints on the dirt path vanishing behind walkers. Strangest of all were the stories of people who entered the park and returned, speaking of glimpses into their past, forgotten moments, lost loves, or mistakes they wished they could undo. For some, it was a curiosity. For others, it became an obsession. Sophie Ward had never believed in urban legends. As a journalist for a small-town magazine, she prided herself on facts and hard evidence. But when her editor assigned her to investigate the backward park, she couldn't resist. The idea was too ridiculous to ignore, yet something about the story pulled at her. Her research revealed vague hints about the park's location. Somewhere near the older part of town, past streets lined with crumbling Victorian homes and overgrown gardens. She found blurry photos online, trees standing unnaturally still, a pond with ripples moving inward instead of outward. It all seemed too perfect to be true. One overcast afternoon, Sophie set out with her camera, a notebook, and a skeptical mind. It didn't take long before she stumbled upon it. The entrance was unassuming. A wrought iron gate rusted with age, partially obscured by ivy. A small wooden sign above the gate read, "Chrysalis Park," in faded letters. Sophie pushed open the creaky gate, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment Sophie stepped into the park, the air felt different, heavier, charged like the moment before a thunderstorm. The chirping of birds was absent, replaced by an odd, faint hum. She wandered the winding paths, her sneakers crunching on gravel. At first, she saw nothing unusual. But then she noticed the leaves. A gust of wind sent them fluttering from the ground, upward. She froze, her camera clutched tightly as she watched the leaves reattach themselves to branches, as if rewinding a film. Her breath hitched. She continued walking, her pulse quickening with every step. By the time she reached the pond at the center of the park, her sense of reality had started to fray. The water rippled inward, creating perfect stillness at its center. Sophie stared at her reflection, watching as droplets of water leaped upward from the surface to rejoin a non-existent rain cloud. Her camera clicked as she captured image after image, though she doubted anyone would believe them. As Sophie ventured deeper, the park began to play tricks on her. She passed a bench where a couple sat, their movements unnaturally smooth, as though played in reverse. The man lifted his arm, his hand retreating from the woman's shoulder, their laughter swallowed into silence. She turned away, her head spinning. Her path led her to a small clearing where a swing set stood, eerily still. But as she approached, the swings began to move. Not forward, but backward, as if unseen children were unswinging themselves. The sight chilled her to the bone. Then she heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable. Her name. Sophie! She spun around, her heart in her throat. The voice had sounded familiar, achingly so. She called out, but the park only answered with its strange hum. And yet, as she stood there, memories began to surface. Memories she hadn't thought of in years. Her mother's laughter when she was a child, her first heartbreak, the night her father left without saying goodbye. The park wasn't just reversing time, it was dredging up the past. In the park's farthest corner, Sophie found an old stone clock tower, its hands moving backward with a faint grinding noise. The tower was weathered and covered in ivy, but it radiated an undeniable power. Drawn to it, she pushed open its heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the air thick with dust. A spiral staircase wound upward, and Sophie climbed it cautiously, each step echoing in reverse, as though the tower itself resisted her presence. At the top, she found a room filled with clocks, antique pocket watches, ornate grandfather clocks, even digital alarm clocks, all ticking backward in perfect unison. At the center of the room stood an old man, his back to her. He wore a long coat, and his hair was a shock of white. When he turned, his face was lined with age, but his eyes sparkled with an unsettling clarity. "You've come to understand," he said simply. "Understand what?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. "The park's purpose," he replied. "It shows us what we've lost, what we've forgotten, and sometimes, if we're lucky, it gives us a chance to change." Sophie's mind raced. "Change how? What do you mean?" The old man smiled sadly. "Time flows in one direction for a reason, but here, it bends. It's not a gift, Sophie. It's a test." The old man gestured to a small mirror on the table beside him. "Look into it," he said. "See what you've left undone." Hesitant, Sophie stepped forward and gazed into the mirror. At first, she saw only her reflection, but then the image shifted, showing scenes from her past, her teenage years, her first love, the argument with her father the night he left. Her heart ached as she watched herself say words she wished she could take back. She saw the tears in her father's eyes as he walked out the door. "You can go back," the old man said, "but only once, and only at a cost." "What cost?" Sophie whispered. "Your future," he replied. "Every moment you change will alter the path ahead. You won't be the same person you are now." Sophie's hands trembled. The temptation was overwhelming, but so was the fear. She had spent years regretting that night with her father. But could she sacrifice her present for a chance to rewrite the past? The old man stepped aside, revealing a doorway glowing with golden light. "The choice is yours," he said. Sophie stared at the doorway, her heart pounding. Memories of her father flooded her mind, mingling with the life she had built since then. Could she risk losing everything she had now for a chance to fix her mistakes? After what felt like an eternity, she shook her head. I can't, she said, tears streaming down her face. I have to live with what I've done. The old man nodded, his expression inscrutable. Wise, perhaps, he said, but the pain will remain. I'll find a way to live with it, Sophie replied. The room began to fade, the clocks slowing their backward march. As Sophie descended the spiral staircase, the park seemed to dissolve around her. When she stepped back through the wrought iron gate, the world outside felt brighter, sharper, as if time itself had reasserted its grip. Sophie never returned to Chrysalis Park, though the memories of that day stayed with her. She wrote about it in her article, though she left out the details of the clock tower and the old man. Most readers dismissed it as fiction, but a few reached out, sharing their own strange experiences with the park. For Sophie, the park became a reminder, not of what she had lost, but of what she still had. Time moved forward, as it always did, and she vowed to make the most of every moment. Because she knew, better than anyone, that some things could never be undone.